Afterwards. Welcome back, everyone, to the second and final panel of the day. And I do hope that many of you will still linger after the panel is over at the reception so that we can begin or continue the conversations, because the conversations are really important. What I was telling some of our members is, what I would hate is if we have a conference in 10 years, HSS at Notre Dame 10 years later, and we all get back together again for just the second time and start talking about this. So it needs to be a continuing dialogue. The second panel was really kind of a happy accident. We had Nicole and Bridget and Sarah on campus earlier this year, and Chris and Catherine Brading said, wow, we really need to bring them back here. And so the occasion of the conference and the fact that they all work on medically related issues, and Chris is a specialist in that field, made it for a logical and no-brainer panel. And when we're talking about the importance of humanities in the sciences, many of you know that the MCAT is now being restructured so that there's more of an essay component to it, which is scaring lots of female students to death. And so this is a very timely topic as to what specifically the humanities can do for medicine. And I have asked Chris, and he's generously agreed to chair the panel. And I don't think he has a big gavel. Do you have a... No?
Well, thanks. And just to reiterate what various people have said this morning, I say this just as a private citizen, how much we appreciate having the History of Science Society here, and how much it's nice to have a conversation with the leadership of the History of Science Society that is also about the making of our curriculum and our university. And that's, I think, what's supposed to happen is happening. So I'm going to try to make it happen a little bit more and take off my remarks a little bit from what Dr. Wheatley was talking about, because I think one of the things that we want to think about is the way in which our discipline as historians of science fits in with other kinds of humanistic studies and and the study of science as well, in this case the study of medicine. So we have here a panel of younger scholars who are going to address some of the same kinds of questions that the panel of more senior scholars was doing a few minutes ago. So I want to think first about where the medical humanities might interface with the History of Science Society. I think, anywhere from 5.5 to 7.5 disciplines that I represent, and History of Science is one of them, but I also work in History of Medicine, I work in History of Technology. And if we just think about this, there have been times in the past where to have a session on medicine at a History of Science Society function would have raised eyebrows. There were times in the past where the relations of the history of science and the history of medicine were very delicate. Also with the history of technology, they were very delicate. We live in kinder, gentler days now, and the things that get published in ISIS, might be published in other journals frequently. But there still are some questions that I think that, again, Dr. Whately has raised about, the History of Science Society, as you said, was started in, over almost a century ago, and, the ways in which scholarly disciplines need to sort of rethink themselves in the changing academic environment. There's some very serious issues about that, and some of them are brought up with regard to medical humanities. So the term medical humanities is distinctively not medical history, and in some ways this is accidental. I don't know who's responsible for making that up in the program here, but the three scholars here, probably it's the kind of work that they do that makes maybe the term medical history a little bit inappropriate, because Nicole here next to me is actually a medieval historian who works on medical topics. Sarah is a literary scholar who is interested in the way in which, and a lot of questions, but questions about the way in which linguistic expression is central to medicine. Is that fair to say? Sure. And then Bridget, her CV lists her as a women's and gender historian. She's interested in history of biomedical science, history of sexuality, and the history of technology. So a label, finding one single label for the range of this work would be a little bit difficult. Medical humanities is a sort of umbrella that can do that. And they're here, as Jay sort of suggested, for for some of the kinds of reasons, or with regard to some of the kinds of problems we've been talking about. We had a search earlier in the winter for a postdoc to work in our HPS program, and these scholars were all finalists in that search, and we liked their work very much, and we wanted to make arrangements to have them come back and be part of our intellectual life. And one of the things that we talked about when we were trying to make an appointment here, we had to rethink what our program was about, what our discipline was about. And we have a fairly traditional history and philosophy of science program. And so this work, we all liked this work very much, but it was stretching us in our notions of curricular autonomy or curricular coherence and things like this in ways which we weren't prepared for. And so one of the things we're very happy about is the opportunity to sort of rethink what the history of science is in terms of what these people do. And I want to sort of suggest that, you know, some of the issues that have arisen today suggest why we need sometimes to rethink what our history and philosophy of science program is in terms of the kind of work that you do. So I'm going to move then to make a couple of comments about first of all, the label medical humanities, and use that to make some suggestions about why I find the sort of work that these scholars do to be particularly interesting, but also why I find that an inadequate label for the kind of work that they do. Medical humanities, we talked in the last session about, we were sort of wrestling with the problem of how do you distinguish humanistic scholarship from science. I would raise the question, is medicine a humanity? I think medicine is one of the humanities. Sir Thomas Brown, who is one of Sarah's subjects, would certainly represent that. And yet, the term medical humanities is used in distinction from normal medical training. And somehow it's supposed to fix some kind of a problem that is sort of, I think, perceived to be widely existing in medical institutions. I'm aware of that problem not only as a normal consumer of medical services, but you know, as a teacher, watching my daughter in medical school taking a course in medical humanities in her final year. A course that was decoration, had no intellectual rigor. She called me and said, "This is coloring, learning to color inside the lines." Jessica suggests it's more like learning to color outside the lines. She did, however, mention there was one work on the syllabus that she thought I might be interested in. Turned out I'd written it. So I have that kind of experience. She was very interested in humanistic aspects of medicine when she went to medical school. Got completely turned off while she was in medical school. The other thing, the sort of status of medical humanities on this campus, you can fill any course immediately if you call it medical humanities. You get a bunch of very good students who have been told that they need to be humanized, and they somehow think that I can do it. They will come at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I sort of say, how can I humanize you? I can teach you lots of things, but I can't make you be a good human being. And there's something sort of tragic about this, because here we have an enterprise that is concerned, it's full of compassionate and caring people, and it's concerned about dealing with people in difficult situations. Very humanistic kind of enterprise. And yet I think many of us would recognize that as we confront medical institutions, they are dehumanized in all sorts of ways. I'm currently reviewing a book about art, the art of healing, and thinking about there are many kinds of works of art which have been produced in the past, which produced in a contemporary clinical setting would be actually obscene because of the dehumanization of so many medical institutions. Okay? So we might sort of think about, in the context of thinking about the history of science, you know, what could our scholarship perhaps be, or should our scholarship be, to kind of address some of those kinds of issues, and should it be called medical humanities? Well, institutional changes are making that perhaps likely. The Wellcome Foundation, which has for a long time supported work in the history of medicine, is now sort of rethinking its sort of remit and calling it medical humanities, and that may suggest that the kinds of things that the history of Science Society wants to support, need to sort of expand to take that into account. Now, as I say, I recoil from the term medical humanities, but I sort of embrace the kind of work that these scholars do. And one of the reasons I do that is because it seems to me that all their work, and they're going to talk to you about their work in a minute here, it's about issues of bodies and health. And we all have bodies, and we all sort of interact with medical institutions in times very often of great stress. We are in situations where we're trying to think about our own self-identity as a kind of biological being. And if we think about this only in terms of the science that's being an attribute of the people who are treating us, we're probably not going to have a particularly sensitive idea of the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of interactions that are going on in those clinical encounters. And so one of the things, we're calling the work of these scholars medical humanities because in some sense it's not the history of medical sciences that all of you are doing. But it's crucially important to the dialogic aspect of those medical encounters. So, History of Science Society is about science. It's not necessarily about bodies and health, but bodies and health are very much part of the public interactions that populations have with medical institutions. So, to finish with this, I sort of have been trying to think about, if I don't like medical humanities, I know I like the work of these people. Is there a better label that I could give it? Interdisciplinarity is not simply going to do it, and medical humanities is kind of an interdisciplinary label. We've heard a lot about interdisciplinarity. I'm very concerned that interdisciplinarity is sort of the magic mushroom of the day, and that it's supposed to produce some kind of wonderful effect. I'm a great believer in disciplinarity, though I have a sense that disciplinarity changes historically. And I'm concerned about disciplinarity because I think disciplines, in some sense, embody rigor, if there is any such thing. So one of the things I'd like to ask the panel and the rest of you to think about is, is there a way that we can broaden the history of science in certain ways, that we can take the kind of work that these scholars are doing, make it not simply a number of particular items under some broad heading, but have a rigor that crosses time and place, deals with issues of body and health, and that can be part of the sorts of public discussions that need to happen, part of the humanizing of medical students that needs to happen, so that the kinds of things that Dr. Wheatley has raised, where we have this attack on the academy, some of the reasons for those attacks can perhaps be mitigated and go away. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Nicole, and then to Sarah, and then to Bridget.
Thank you. First, before I get started, let me say thank you to Jay and Catherine and Chris for making it possible for me to be here and inviting me in the first place. I'm a medievalist. I know it's not the first person you think of necessarily in terms of history of science, and someone who does this, whatever we want to call it, is someone who's also, maybe not a first choice for history of Science Society, but I'm excited to be here and excited to, potentially create new links and bridges. Jay asked each of us to think about how our work in the humanities enriches our understanding of medicine. So I constructed my presentation around this. I'm going to start by describing my big questions, the project I'm working on now, and then some things that I'd like to work on in the future. I am a social and cultural historian of the Middle Ages. I'm focusing now on sickness and healing in the broadest sense. I'm particularly interested in questions about how non-specialists, people like sufferers or their families, understood and expressed their knowledge of illness and health. I'm interested in the kinds of healthcare options that people pursued, and whenever possible in my sources, I'm interested in why they chose one option over another. And finally, I'm also interested in healing practitioners who span what we perceive as separate categories of healing. Not necessarily what people in the Middle Ages would have seen as separate categories, but separate categories for us. So this would be someone who performed both medicine or magic, both medicine and magic, or who spanned medicine and religion. The main example I'm working with right now is an individual named Durand André, who was a cathedral canon, a medical doctor, and a confessor, and practiced all three simultaneously. So he was a healer of both body and soul, and his healing practices overlapped in interesting ways. In my book project, which I am presently titling Body and Soul Under Siege, Plague, War, and the Anxiety of Confession in the 14th Century, I bring these questions together. Or I think even a better way of saying it would be that these questions emerged from the core source of the project, which is the witness testimony in the canonization inquest of Delphine de Puy-Michel, held in 1363 in Provence. There are a couple of reasons why this text is so special and why it helped me generate this set of research questions. First, the organizers of the inquest allowed witnesses a great deal of freedom in their testimonies, and the witnesses took full advantage of that freedom. They described their experiences of the first two waves of plague, the mercenary invasions that they lived through during the 100 Years' War, and they described a local civil war, telling stories about their experiences at this time that we just don't find in other kinds of sources. The second special thing about this inquest are the witnesses themselves. Over 70 people were questioned, including members of the papal court, business people, legal officials, soldiers, servants, and members of the aristocracy. These were predominantly wealthy, educated people, or their servants, who had connections to major political centers and intellectual centers, and they plug us into the major political movements of the time. So that we are looking at individuals, we are getting a very interesting, broader picture. These witnesses are also the kinds of people in the 14th century who had access to the most diverse healthcare options, which they explored and spoke about in these testimonies. And finally, like all canonization inquests, witnesses described so many different kinds of illness, from stillbirth, drought, dropsy, gout, toothache, fever, insanity, just to name a few. They were talking about their experiences of all of these diverse illnesses. And since these witnesses had so much freedom in their testimonies, we learn a lot about their knowledge, their expectations, and their strategies for their own health care and the health care of their families. One of the most interesting correlations, however, that emerges from the testimonies taken as a whole is the anxiety about confession at this moment in the 14th century and the state of one's soul. Decades of devastating epidemics and destabilizing warfare made sudden death a daily worry for these people, from which I argue emerged an anxiety about the sacrament of confession. And the anxiety took different shapes for different people. Witnesses worried about the faculty of memory. They worried about their ability to remember the events in their past, the sins that they had committed, to make sure that they were confessing everything. They worried about their inability to stop wanting to do sinful things. They worried about, in other words, they worried about their intentions. And many witnesses described a desire for a guarantee that one had confessed everything. This appeared hand in hand with a desire to feel changed after confession, to have a physical sensation of change after confession. And when these desires were not met, some of the witnesses experienced debilitating anxiety, some of which experienced it to an extent that it threatened their lives. These sufferers to deal with this, turned to a variety of healing methods and practitioners, which included this holy woman Delphine, and also interestingly included her medical doctor and confessor, de Rondandre, the person I was speaking about earlier. So that's a very specific view of what I'm doing. But by thinking broadly about healing and illness and focusing on practitioners who cross boundaries, or the boundaries that we see between medicine and religion, we can better see how sufferers facing overlapping crises of war and epidemic understood their experiences and strategized about their own healing, and perhaps even expressed some of the despair and distress they were feeling at the time in physical ways through their illness. We get a better sense also of what they saw as underlying problems at the time, and the blurred boundaries for them between medicine and religion, body and soul. My explorations of the sufferer's expectations and needs gives us insight into healing practitioners as well, especially at this moment in the 14th century, the later part of the 14th century, when university-trained medical practitioners became far more common, far more available for wealthy communities, and existed alongside local practitioners, saints, and various kinds of other solutions. So that's the work I'm doing right now, and in the future, I want to continue to look at how people understood illness and health and pursue their healing options, but I'm moving into looking at hospitals in port cities in the Middle Ages. So hospital obviously means something different in the Middle Ages than it does now, but they were still places where people received healing in many ways. And my goals are to find treatments, medicines, potentially practitioners that moved from one region to another across the Mediterranean, and even across boundaries like religion and medicine. I'm interested in particular to see if I can find sufferers sharing their knowledge about physical and spiritual healing in these port cities and the communities created in hospitals in port cities. So that, in a nutshell, is what I'm working on right now. I don't know if I've answered any of your questions, but you can ask me questions later.
Thank you. So my name is Sarah, and similarly, I want to express a lot of thanks to Jay and to Chris and to Catherine. This has been a tough year, I guess, my first year on the job market, and this is by far the best rejection that I got. And so I'm really, really appreciative for that. I've made a lot of friends here, and I'm very impressed with the school and with HSS. And so my work is in the early modern period, and specifically is starting in the late 15th century and going up through the 17th century. My training is in literature, so I'm a little nervous about that in terms of the audience today, so I hope that I'll give a good context and sort of show the relevance of what I'm doing in terms of all of our interdisciplinary interests. So I'm gonna read some and chat some, so hopefully this will work out and will last the proper amount of time. So we come to illness alone. Yet at this deeply personal and individual moment, our bodies are subjected to the classificatory rigors of medicinal categorization. The tension between the personal experience of disease and the universalizing categories of diagnosis and treatment has been a major concern in Western medicine since the 5th century writings attributed to Hippocrates. And this is 5th century BC, so very long time. So on the one hand, the Hippocratic treatises emphasized each patient's particular encounter with illness, while less than a century later, Greek philosopher Aristotle insisted that we only truly know that which we can classify and organize. Many of the treatises from the Hippocratic corpus dismiss any links between the practice of medicine and the development of universal categories. The Hippocratic text, Regimen in Acute Diseases, offers a particularly cogent example of such an approach. It opens with an attack on doctors who attempt to classify and name all possible illnesses. The author, the Hippocratic author, rejects this therapeutic strategy that would treat patients according to a predetermined classification of their medical problems, arguing that such an approach is ultimately bad for the patient, because a doctor relying on the abstract classification of diseases to treat a patient's sickness risks ignoring the patient in question. Furthermore, the author goes on to claim, the task of classifying itself is actually impossible. And this is a quote. For the number, meaning the number of diseases, will be almost incalculable if a patient's disease be diagnosed as different whenever there's a difference in the symptoms. While a mere variety of name is supposed to constitute, when a mere variety of name is supposed to constitute a variety of the illness, end quote. So, rather than focusing on identifying and naming the illnesses, the good physician should instead get to know the habits and customs of the individual patient and devise treatment accordingly. So this is an approach to therapeutics that rejects the notion that a physician's training would involve a kind of study of these abstract classifications, and instead focuses on the particularities of interpersonal interaction. I think this speaks a lot to what Chris was bringing up at the beginning of the panel. So in the initial passage of his Metaphysics, by contrast, Aristotle sets up a project that would describe why and how we accumulate knowledge by gathering groups of experiences that seem to correspond to each other and placing these into larger abstract categories. And for Aristotle, this is really what knowledge is. I guess everyone in here probably knows pretty well, since that's sort of the foundation of science. So Aristotle actually gives medicine as a central example of this kind of knowledge formation. So this is a quote from the Metaphysics. Now, art arises when, from many notions gained by experience, one universal judgment about a class of objects is produced. For to have a judgment that when Callias was ill of this disease, this did him good, and similarly in the case of Socrates and in many individual cases, is a matter of experience. But to judge that it has done good to all persons of a certain constitution marked off in one class when they were ill of this disease, e.g. to phlegmatic or bilious people when burning with fevers, this is a matter of art. So what he's saying there is, when we stop saying this individual person had this individual experience, and we start to group people together into, these team role classifications that were really dominant in our understanding of medicine for hundreds of years after that, that is what Aristotle understands as real knowledge, that process of classification. So in my work, which is in early stages compared to a lot of people in this room, but I'm interested in this tension and the way that it shows up in the early modern period. In that period, Hippocrates and Aristotle were among the most cited figures in discussions of medicine, and their divided understandings of the body as a site of knowledge led to extensive epistemological debates in learned medicine. So my project is titled Contrary Signs, Categorizing Illness in Early Modern Literature. And I'm interested in the way that this debate shows up. I think this kind of thing has been discussed in histories of medicine, but I want to argue that we can learn a lot about, or we can gain a new perspective on this problem by looking at it through the lens of certain literary forms that were being produced in this period. And I'm focusing on the work of 6 authors with a lot of minor figures coming into play. And these are Girolamo Fracastoro, who was a late 15th, early 16th century Italian physician, who wrote an epic poem where he coined the word syphilis, which maybe not everybody knows was originally from a myth that he created to try to explain this new disease showing up in Europe, or what there were debates about whether it was a new disease, but it certainly seemed to be coming out of nowhere. Working with François Rabelais, who's known mostly as a literary author, but was trained as a physician, as well as Thomas Browne, as Chris mentioned, who was another physician author of the 17th century. And I'm also writing on 2 illness narratives written from the perspectives of patients. So Michel de Montaigne's famous discussion of his encounter with kidney stones, and then John Donne's writings on his illness. And so the project investigates this relationship between the particular and the universal as it is explored in writings both literary and medical. In early modern Europe, the disciplinary boundaries that now divide the humanities and the sciences hadn't been established, and the debates over the relative importance of the individual's experience with illness and the priority of classification extended into disciplines that we now consider literary. I trace the extensive literary engagement with medicine's conflicting aims, the growing concern to name and classify diseases, and the palpable fact of the patient's particularity. So in the course of my research, I've identified two key developments that influenced the debate over where to position the particular patient within the study of theoretical medicine. First, a growing trend towards introspection created more narrative space for the valorization of particularity, which I argue is evidenced by an increase in autobiographical work in this period. You have very few strictly autobiographical writings before the early modern period. You get famous examples like St. Augustine's Confessions and that sort of thing. But beginning in the 16th century, there are a lot more things being written with the first person point of view. And I argue that this brings an interesting perspective to this problem of particularity, especially the examples that I'm giving of Montaigne and Donne, which are really great examples, but we also have a number of other kinds of examples of this. Even Boyle writes on an experience that he has with illness. And then the second trend that I identify is the influence of Protestantism and the Protestant, this is a little overstated, but the move away from communal forms of worship towards an emphasis on individual spirituality, and the way that this creates more space for the individual. Now, this is an old narrative in early modern studies, all the rise of the subject and that sort of thing, but the point that I'm trying to make is that this can enter into debates in the history of medicine in important and, I think, exciting new ways. And in terms of some of the things that Chris was bringing up at the beginning of the panel, I think that this does have a kind of modern relevance in terms of the way that we think about medical education today. And these are still, I think I identify those tensions with Hippocrates and Aristotle, but it's the same, it's just a restatement of what Chris was saying at the beginning of probably an experience that every single one of us has had with the very individual experience of illness, and then going into the medical context where that gets explained to you in these abstract ways, and you think, well, wait a minute. And there are all kinds of responses to that now. First-person responses, blogs. You have more and more physicians writing memoirs as they kind of grapple with the tension between the abstract science of what they're doing and the kind of day-to-day, human aspects of it. So I'll stop there. I have a lot more, but if anybody wants to hear more about my project, we could do it at another point.
Okay. Well, I would also like to echo many, many thanks for being able to be here today. Thanks to Jay, to Chris, and to Catherine. This has just been wonderful and really generative for me. So today I'm going to share a little of my current work, which is on the 150-plus year history relationship between assisted reproductive technologies, biomedicine, and the making of American families. My talk is going to focus on what potential lessons artificial insemination offers towards deepening our understanding of the roles that gender and sexuality play in embedding a technology in American medicine and culture. After a description of the project, I will also discuss how the study of the first assisted reproductive technology adds to current conversations about the impact of such technologies on the formation of new identities and relationships between families, patients, and their healthcare providers. So my dissertation is called Making Synthetic Babies, and it investigates what factors influence major shifts across time in the understanding of what it meant to assist reproduction. These factors included evolving notions of masculinity, femininity, sexuality, and the place of a marriage in American society. They encompass the emergence of the modern physician and of specialties, namely gynecology, urology, and andrology, and of new scientific understandings of reproduction, of new industrial interests in fertility, of boundaries between human, animal, and plant, and the ways that models and knowledge move from one domain into another. My project has both a broad scope and it uses a diverse array of sources that offer access into the private worlds of men and women making decisions to use artificial insemination to create families. These sources include clinical records, biomedical journals, patient letters, feature films, popular magazines, and newspapers. So it's structured as a biography of sorts of a reproductive technology, and there are 5 different stages that trace how artificial insemination is successively used and debated in labs, clinics, and in culture. So the procedure was first practiced in America in the mid-19th century by infamous gynecologist Jane Marion Sims. However, there was little consensus about how and when to use such a technology at this point in its history. So using nomenclature as a lens, I'd show how shifting terms reflected this lack of agreement about the nature of unreproductive bodies. For example, artificial fructification and fecundation reflected medical understandings of infertility as an almost exclusively female condition, until new concerns about failing masculinity and an increased access to male bodies during World War I spurred research on semen, shifting the terminology to artificial insemination. In the early 20th century, a new science of genetics and eugenic reforms transformed AI, which I'll throw that in from now on just to make it move along, okay, into a scientific practice with implications for populations as well as for couples. For instance, by the 1930s, scientific and popular reforms allowed gynecologists like famed president of the American Gynecological Association, Dr. Robert L. Dickinson, to simultaneously revolutionize procedures for the sterilization of the unfit and practice artificial insemination as a simple means to, quote, achieve the betterment of the race. So the power of eugenic ideas in reproductive medicine opened the door for donor insemination to emerge as a practice, I argue. As the turn away from using husband sperm in inseminations progressed, guidelines for securing donor anonymity, patient's privacy, and doctor's professional status emerged. So began the destruction of donor records, the switching of patients to unknowing obstetrical providers for birth care, and the American Congress of Gynecology's active suppression of physicians who discussed the procedure publicly. And then by the post-World War II era, artificial insemination underwent its third transformation. Under the guidance of the new American Society for the Study of Sterility, it became symbolically and practically remade as a tool to rehabilitate damaged veterans' bodies, as well as childless and therefore un-American marriages. Amidst a backdrop of Cold War anxieties about homosexuality and the status of the United States as a nation, 1,600 paraplegic veterans petitioned the VA to offer donor services, and an estimated 50,000 babies were born using the method by 1960. And yet, as research on cryopreservation traveled from the farm into the new American infertility clinics, new fears about safety and regulation of the method became apparent. In the decades to follow, as society struggled to understand the implications of a radically new means of limiting reproduction with the release of the birth control pill, paradoxically, an exponential growth in the number of providers offering insemination services occurred. And infertility centers, like the Rock Reproductive Clinic in Boston, new clinical spaces for men emerged, and a host of new professional actors, including psychiatrists, sociologists, and marriage counselors, participated in the care of the infertile. And their concerns about the mental health of children, the transference of wives' affection from husband to donor, the legal and moral ambiguity of the practice, along with a growing anti-motherhood rhetoric, suppressed in new ways the ability of historical actors to acknowledge the growing use of the practice. So by the late 1970s and 1980s, new users came on the scene, namely lesbians and single women, and changed the character of artificial insemination yet again. The women's health and gay rights movements began to slowly create alternative insemination methods. These were practiced outside of medical supervision or at pioneering community health centers serving lesbian clientele, including the Fenway in Boston or the Sperm Bank of California in Oakland. Alternative insemination heralded the beginning of the so-called lesbian baby boom that was shortly to fall under the shadow of the AIDS crisis. So HIV drove providers to adopt new cryopreservation technologies. It allowed time for STI, sexually transmitted infections, to be tested over the samples. And these factors together created a new model, the contemporary model of the business of sperm banking, one that currently helps to create about, they think, 60,000 babies per year in the United States. So all this taken together, it seems like every day a new story emerges about assisted reproduction. From a recent New York Times article that some of you may have seen about one sperm donor, 150 offspring, to the 2012 Supreme Court decision against the right of children conceived using their dead father's sperm to his Social Security benefits, or new scientific research on so-called artificial sperm, to more popular portrayals of queer parenting in The Kids Are All Right, the movie. And the frequency of such cases attests to the growing place of assisted reproductive technologies in American life, and the complicated nature of the questions raised by their use. So these encompass technological anxieties about what is and is not natural, legal and policy concerns about reproductive autonomy, complex understandings of kinship and family, and the legacy of eugenics in modern medicine. So although much of the current scholarship on assisted reproduction focuses on post-1980 high-tech methods of intervention, namely in vitro fertilization and egg donation, I hope that my work helps to reframe the relationships between technology, biology, and the business of assisted reproductive medicine as not only a constellation of the late 20th century. So the history of artificial insemination, I believe, offers a different and a wider lens with which to view both the trajectory of assisted reproductive technologies in American culture and a new perspective on reproductive technologies within American marriages and biomedicine. So in a literature on the history of gender and sexuality and reproduction that has tended to concentrate on birth control and abortion, shifting the perspective to conversations and debates about a conceptive rather than a contraceptive technology allows, I found, an increased role for men and the history of their sexual and reproductive health to surface. So reflecting on this technological biography, there are a number of continuities that can be gleaned, including that the nature of the basic act of assisted insemination, namely the injection of sperm via syringe to aid in conception, has remained relatively unchanged. That apprehensions about artificiality, marriage, sexuality, and desire when sex is removed from reproduction are concerns for actors across eras, as are fears about safety, regulation, and control of the market for insemination. There are notable discontinuities too. First, the sanctioned use of sperm from a donor. Second, the use of donor profiles by patients rather than physicians. And thirdly, changing legal and social understandings of parenthood. So here I'm talking about new identities like that of a social father, or a donor dad, or even lesbian moms. So a historical analysis of the multitude of these formulations that I've talked about that have taken place in the past, from its use as a tool to preserve injured soldiers' manhood, to its role in the creation of queer parenthood, makes the current patterns that assisted reproductive technologies and their institutions seem perhaps less stable and normalized. As physicians, scientists, and society consider the current explosion of fertility technologies and their implications for men, women, and families, my work provides a historical perspective on these debates in biomedicine and in society.
Before throwing this open, I think you'll understand why I find all these works so fascinating, first of all. But also, even though, I mean, Bridget is talking about things that come up to the present. The other two of you are talking about things that are sort of in the centuries back. But, you know, as I listen to you and I think about this, so many of the issues resonate. And so you're speaking to us as scholars, but I think you're also speaking to a public conversation. So my original comments are, you know, I'm very concerned about how our disciplines interface with these public conversations. And I think a lot of us are in the disciplines we're in because we're unsatisfied with the character of those public conversations. And, you know, we have these wild idealistic hopes that somehow, because we're talking about these things in sensitive, thoughtful, historically sophisticated ways, that our talking to our students somehow translates into, you know, the public discourse of these. So, you know, I just want to thank you again because, you know, you you do, I listen to you and I say, yes, I want to talk about those things with my students. I want to see those kinds of issues talked about in the South Bend Tribune, which is probably not going to happen. But I want those to be part of our public political conversations anyway. So the floor is open. Nick in the back there.
Didn't want to be the first question. All right. I guess thinking about this idea of what is the term, medical humanities, it seems like if we can agree that there's that these, reflective of these talks we've just heard, that these studies of literature and history are indeed studies of human culture and behavior. I wonder, can we, and if we're also willing to draw extemporaneous connections while appreciating the sophisticated contingencies behind medical cultures, why not allow this to sort of fall under the banner of a kinder, gentler sort of medical anthropology that would be, historically, I guess, calibrated, rather than looking towards making universal laws?
Nick speaks as a recovering anthropologist.
Yeah, that's carrying on. Sorry. So yeah, why not? Or why? I don't know.
You said why not?
Let's see why not. Let's see why not. Sorry.
Let's see, I just got back not that long ago from the American Anthropological Association conference, so I'm trying to remember the conversations that we were having there within medical anthropology. And I think that that's one of those things that maybe you're speaking to, is that there can be movement across these disciplines. And yet, I think that the focus on methodologies in anthropology made me, as a historian, a little uncomfortable. Participant-centered observation is not something that historians tend to do all that often. And we have our own standards for oral history, right, that include a lot of contextualization. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that perhaps there is a space for deeper historical analysis within medical anthropology, and yet I think that without a deep, rich understanding of the cultural contexts, which are incredibly varied, that comes with a historical training period, that it would be very hard to have those conversations in a really complex way.
I guess, and I'm coming at this not with training as an historian, but studying literature, and kind of bringing a lot of historical work to bear on a new kind of reading. And I don't have training in anthropology. I've taught a lot of pre-med students who are interested in anthropology or pre-public health or something like that, and I encourage them to follow that kind of track for a major, because I think it's a good, it provides a lot of good background. But in terms of my work, I'm interested specifically in the language that's being produced in these contexts. So if someone, in the 16th century comes down with kidney stones, how does he express that experience, and what are the metaphors that doctors are using to describe the patients that they encounter, and that sort of thing. So that would, I don't know if that answers your question.
And I'm not really sure that what I'm talking about overlaps that much with medical anthropology, but it certainly overlaps with this idea of looking at the language. My first incarnation was as a linguistic anthropologist. In some ways, some of my training is in this, and so I was very shaped by questions from discourse analysis. This idea of looking at how people talk and how people do things with words in some ways, and looking at how conversations come about, and I think that informs my research in looking at witness testimony and trying to get as close as I can to what people are saying and letting them tell me what they think medicine is, what they think illness is, what they think healing is. So I think I'm somewhat inspired by that, but I don't know how well as an ableist I'd fit in a modern anthropology program.
This is great. I think I'm sort of seeing the idea of anthropology is falling back to the sort of Franz Boas, like understanding these different cultures in themselves, the contingencies behind them, and appreciating them, and then eventually drawing something from that. But I can see how the rebuttals work in that. Thank you, all three of you.
I want to respond to your question by objecting to the question. Okay. Because on a sort of cart and horse sorts of principles, in other words, you know, your question is about what should we call the name of the discipline, you know, and maybe we don't. Why do we approach the question first in terms of needing a name for a discipline? You're talking about human experiences that we have. You know, when I go to the doctor, I don't go as a historian. I go as a sick person, you know, and I go. I always think about historically what the doctor's doing, but I go as a sick person, and you know. In some ways, maybe the disciplines help us in those kinds of encounters. But if we only have the encounter as the person who is, you know, expressing our professional discipline, why, that's pretty strange. Because what about all the people who don't have disciplines? You know, most of people in South Bend aren't academics, and so you know, they actually are having these kinds of issues and experiences. So you know. Do I have to be an anthropologist to go and have these kind of interactions with a doctor? Well, no. So in a certain sense, you know, I think we're thinking about the degree to which the things we can bring as disciplines or from our disciplinary training helps us have those kinds of encounters, you know, as a public in better ways. But I think about this in terms of, you know, Weber has this concept of Verstehen, this notion that, you know, as historians we ought to be sympathetic to our actors, as if people who are not historians ought not to be sympathetic to the people that they're you know, encountering. I mean, you know, we behave that way because, you know, it's part of our notion of what it means to be a decent human being, not because somebody's told us that there's this thing called Verstehen and you're supposed to be that way, right? So.
I wanted to ask about what you all see as, you know, up-and-coming scholars as the opportunities and pressures on you to do public writing, and where you see whether you've done any like that, whether you seek opportunities to do that, what that world looks like to you. And I guess I would have, although it pushes in a different question, I have a similar question if other people don't have questions about doing digitized research. But I would hold off on that second one in favor of the first one.
Go ahead.
This is something I think is very important, and something that I've shaped much of my professional self around, is making myself as much a writer as a historian, and spending a lot of time developing my writing skills and being able to, you know, try to reach across not just disciplines but also reach outside of academia to get to a broader audience. And I've done this by taking a lot of writing workshops, going to a lot of programs where I'm surrounded by people who are interested in writing, not just writing in academia, but writing fiction, writing nonfiction, writing plays, writing all kinds of things. And this is, I'm actually going straight from this to the Santa Barbara Writers Conference. And spending a week with, you know, surrounded by writers who are interested in how do we communicate our ideas and get them out there. It's one of the things that shaped the knowledge that getting a book published is difficult and getting it read is even more difficult. Is something that shaped my topic. I knew that if I talked about plague and war, I had a much higher likelihood of getting an audience and getting published than if I just talked about saints and the soul. So it shaped how I've constructed my entire project, and how I've constructed myself as a scholar has been shaped by the knowledge that I've got to write. This is the most important thing I can do, is communicate to other people.
I think, I haven't done any of that kind of stuff in terms of the writing. Like, I haven't really thought about writing for a specifically popular audience as a goal of mine. On the other hand, I think that all young scholars are pretty aware that academic publishing is getting tougher and tougher as a market, and I think it's important to be a good writer. Coming out of literature, that's like sort of our, workhorse class is to teach writing over and over again, and so I've thought a lot about writing for clarity, but I think in terms of the accessibility of what I'm doing, I channel a lot more of that energy into teaching. And this came up in the previous panel, what kinds of institutions are training graduate students to specialize and specialize and specialize to the point where you can't really talk to undergraduates when you finally get a job. I went to a public school, so I've been doing a lot of teaching all along, and so, that's something that I've had to do, ever since I first even started to learn what being an academic might mean. I do think there's a lot of potential in the realm of things like biographies and that sort of publishing, where you can have a group of specialists or someone who's a real specialist who writes something that does get a kind of a broader readership. And I'm potentially interested in that, but I see that as something that you do once you're a little bit more established as a scholar, not, definitely not a dissertation and probably not a second book. So, but that's something that I'm interested in.
I think that the last part of that especially would fit in well with how I think about it. That first you make your scholarly stamp, and then you say the things that you need to say to the broader public. And I think that for me, I very much want to say those things, and they have to do with the nature of agency that people have, that women have and families have in a physician's office. When today it is considered often just to be a process of just kind of uber commodification. So I think that I'd like to speak to those kinds of things, and to talk about how there is a very dirty past to many of these technologies that grew out of artificial insemination, and it's very, very much based in a history of eugenics. I think those are really important conversations to have, especially as genetics becomes more and more broadly used in medicine.
I'll press the writing question, and partly in the digital direction. You've all finished dissertations. It sounds like at least 2, maybe 3 of them have the standard sort of narrative arc of a dissertation. If you didn't have to write the proto-book, would that have been the best way of representing the knowledge that you produced? And what Nicole just described when I was thinking of these testimonies and confessions, it sounds like a series of sort of mini-stories and a sort of Archambeau, Return of Martin Guerre, a sort of much different type of presentation than the sort of narrative. Now I know, it's a sort of hard question to ask when you finish the dissertation. Well, if you didn't have to do that, what would you rather know? But is there, and are you attracted to, or do you see examples among your contemporaries of ways of representing knowledge that are not the simple 4-chapter narrative or 6-chapter narrative?
Well, I could take a minute to plug a book I read that I thought was really good. This biography of Montaigne that's come out fairly recently, Sarah Bakewell, I think, who's at the Welcome, is such a delight. That was such a boon for me, because I work on Montaigne, and all these people in my family are like, who is this guy, and then the book comes out, and it hits the circuit of the sort of educated lay readership, the people who are reading New Yorker and that sort of thing. And all of a sudden everyone's interested in Montaigne. And what she did was, I thought, very creative. I don't know if you all know the book, but she titles the book How to Live, or A Question with 20 Answers, or something like that. And so there are 20 short chapters, each with one way that Montaigne proposes to answer this question of how to live. And it's structured somewhat chronologically like a biography, but also it has a kind of thematic or more intellectual structure. And it's very accessible. It gives a lot of context for the 16th century in France and that sort of thing. And I read that and I thought, wow, I wish I had written that, And I think, I mean, you would get eaten alive if you proposed a dissertation like that probably, but it would be really fun. And I think there's a lot of potential with that kind of scholarship.
Is that what leads you to be interested in biography?
Well, that came after the biography, but reading Montaigne got me interested in biography. I was actually working in 20th century, and I took a Montaigne class that's, wound up in the 16th century.
I would say that I would not give up my experience of writing my dissertation, because it turned me into an effective scholar. It taught me how to do research. It sent me out to the archive. I mean, it made me answer tough questions. And that I wouldn't give up. But at the same time, my dissertation was not a book, and it was not something that could be sent out for anyone to read other than my poor committee. But it's interesting that you asked that question, because a few weeks ago, when I was at the AAHM conference, one of the people in the audience who listened to me talk said, you should really do podcasts of miracles, and then talk about why that is meaningful. And that really clicked. I thought, yeah, this is a great way of telling these little stories, telling very quickly what they mean to people and why, and giving people a glimpse into this culture. That would be a very meaningful way to distill the massive amounts of information we all collect and make it palatable and interesting to others, sort of the Radio Lab approach to various things that we do, is one way of thinking about it. I don't think that would replace my dissertation, though. My dissertation was about me, learning to be a scholar.
I don't have anything that would replace a dissertation, but I think that there are some really interesting ways to speak to a broader public out there. And there is a really cool podcast. It's called The History Your History Teacher Forgot to Tell You, and it's been my favorite running mix lately. Just wacky facts of the type that you would read when you're going to be trapped somewhere for a long time, and are really good in trivia conversations. But I think that I also have a dirty fascination, and it actually probably led me into my love of history, of fiction. And historical fiction is an amazing venue, and when it's done really, really well, I think that it can capture a time and a place, and certainly someone's imagination in a way that is quite powerful.
When you asked the question, I was thinking, what would be the antithesis to a dissertation? It would be a project, the result of a podcast. I was thinking actually a screenplay. But if we asked you all to produce this, a saleable screenplay, which they do in California, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay, so they do that already. But I was curious about the way in which biographic, items come up in this conversation. And when Bridget was talking earlier. One of the things that I kept going back to is, your story is full of personal stories of people who are confronting artificial insemination situations. And then Sarah talked about doing a biography, and it's curious about the sort of ambivalence, bordering on sometimes hostility within history departments towards vignettes that are sort of supposed to illustrate something happening in one person's life. We use them as evidence of something else. We tend to be sort of reluctant to allow them to be important testaments on their own. And also our hostility, a student wants to write a biography, we say, what? And what's the matter with that? And there were earlier times in the historical profession where the writing of biographies of a sort anyway was much more respectable, and yet in some ways the fact that you sort of gravitate toward the biographic says, well, you're talking, and you're using the word imagination, you're talking about ways of communicating with people in a very direct way. And we read biographies because we're interested in human lives and things like that. So that's an interesting thing. I mean, thinking also about historical fiction, the way in which historical fiction about scientists has changed scholarship in the history of science over the past couple of decades. So maybe this is where things are going. and should go.
Well, just a comment and a question. Just to let Nicole know that the last 2 of the 3 Sarton Medalist winners of the Science Society were medievalists, and so we welcome the Middle Ages in science. My wife worked in a neonatal intensive care unit about 10 years ago, and nurses and doctors have a tendency to see neonates as an extension of the machinery, in part because there's a sense of distancing, that they're such helpless little beings, and they want to be able to maintain some kind of objectivity. And so if they're seen as extensions, then it's not quite as difficult when you're faced with what happens to them. And you hear the same language with physicians referring to the liver and 2B that needs to have this 2 o'clock injection and so forth. So what is to be, is part of the process of introducing the humanities, or whatever we want to call it, to medicine, is it to lessen the distance? And if so, what will we gain from that? And I'm thinking about the things like the importance of touch for neonates. That you could put a Facebook page in front of them and you could have them interacting, but that's not the same thing as holding them. And I'm just wondering, what is it that you found in your research that helps with this idea of humanizing medicine? And does it decrease the distance, and is that really a good thing?
I think that's a really challenging question, because it's easy for us. We make our jokes about going into the doctor, and the doctor sees you just as a body, or the liver in room 2 or something. But of course, the people who are dealing with sickness day in and day out, and dealing with death, and especially any death is difficult to deal with, and those kinds of situations, working in neonatal clinics, in a way, it's a kind of a natural defense mechanism. I had a roommate my first year of graduate school who was a med student, and I was appalled at the story she would tell me from the anatomy lab, where basically I felt like what the med school students were learning in the anatomy lab was to see the body as a thing, and this is a really disturbing fact of medical education that's kind of feels almost like the opposite of what I would be trying to do if I, were working with either pre-med or medical students. But I think, as with so many of these questions, it's about the balance between the two. Not taking, any doctor who completely empathizes with every single patient is going to be miserable and not be able to be a true professional. But on the other hand, that kind of complete distance and sort of mechanization of the body can be really destructive too.
Go for it.
I think that one of the most that touched me the most when I was going through my research was actually the interactions between really desperate patients who were writing home from wars, trying to get access for their wives, tracking their wives' menstrual cycles from off on the front, and that the reaction that the physicians that I was looking at had was incredibly thoughtful, and there was a lot more interaction in taking of the case as well. And I think that has perhaps decreased over time, and so that's perhaps a lesson that could be learned, is that the kind of knowledge that can be gleaned from the very full life story. These are the sources you really want to find as a historian, right? The full life story of a patient actually makes for a better overall experience for everyone.
In thinking about that, and what you guys have said as well, I think my work doesn't necessarily challenge the distance there, but it does challenge the assumptions that can come from distance. Assumptions about what sufferers know, their autonomy, their ability to make choices other than Western medicine and why they might do that. Those are the kinds of things that I think might be useful to rethink some of those ideas about. If you're just thinking about the liver in 2B, you're not thinking about the fact that this person could go somewhere else or choose something else or know a lot about themselves. And that can be useful, perhaps.
This is just a comment on this particular thing that Jay raised. One thing I think all of your work challenges is what the goals of medical science are, what the goals of medicine are. And this really touches on the eugenics thing that you were mentioning. It's something that came up in the talk we had with Mark Larkin earlier this semester. You know, what are we trying to achieve with medicine? Are we trying to achieve the human being that's never sick and never disabled? Well, no, that doesn't need to key into a lot more about what it is to be a human being in order to understand what we're trying to achieve in medical science. And that's one thing that I think all of your work has in common. So you're pressing us to reconsider and to think harder about what are we trying to do. Thank you for your work. It's great.
I think with that, you know, we're about at our time. It's a kind of nice coda to wind this up. I mean, it's a sort of a sobering coda, it sounds like. But, you know, just in terms of Jay's comment, some years ago, Susan Sontag wrote a very famous book, Illness as Metaphor, which she sort of said that we should not attach meaning to our illnesses, and yet we all do. And I think, you know, and we're not going to stop. And so, you know, we're attaching meaning to our illnesses as we attach meaning to our lives. And so, you know, this is the richness of your work. I think sort of to appreciate that, to recognize that, to try to sort of say, you know, we have to grapple with those kinds of things. So, I mean, these are conversations that we have a nice long reception. Where is the reception? Okay, so it's back across the street. Do you have, Jay, do you have
the Notre Dame room?
Notre Dame room.
How do you get there, Greg?
This is downstairs, right?
Right, you go in, you go to the left, and go downstairs.
Okay. So, do you have concluding remarks, Ben?
Well, I would like to thank everyone on the panel.
Okay.